Now, let's jump over and say hello to my guest who is standing by, Gerald Celente. Hi, Gerald.
Hey, Gary. Nice being on with you.
Gerald, I've got a bunch of topics I'd like to get down, and I'd like for you to address them if you would, please.
Okay.
First up, this is from David Lindorf, and it's called The Police State of America. Here's what he says, quote, "I no longer recognize my country. Back in 1997, after 2 years living in China and 5 more years living in Hong Kong, during which I was a correspondent for Businessweek magazine, I slipped in and out of China regularly as a journalist to report on developments there. I got a good dose of life in a totalitarian society. But then I landed back in Philadelphia with my family, about to start a new chapter in my lives, and I remember feeling a big weight lifted off my chest, and the sense of freedom was palpable." And he says, "Almost immediately, though, I got an inkling that something was amiss. An art teacher in Upper Dublin, a suburban town where we had bought a house, had just been arrested, charged with theft of $400 in school art supplies. Of course, my initial reaction was, great, school district we're in if the teachers are stealing from the school. The teacher, Luann Merkel, who had been arrested and briefly jailed pending arraignment, was fired and faced trial on a felony charge of stealing public property. But in a few weeks, as I followed the story in the local paper, it became clear that there had really been no theft. She was simply taking some old, out-used supplies and was replacing with new ones. And then she was bringing the old supplies to a local community center in a low-income children's area to be used by daycare and after-school children in poor neighborhoods. Moreover, when stopped by the principal and told that the old supplies had to be put in the dumpster, she complied. She was arrested anyhow at her home. I later learned over subsequent weeks of news reports that Miss Merkel actually was being hounded by an obsessive, power-tripping school administrator simply for being, quote, an activist. She was simply an outspoken teacher. A school board hearing I attended was packed in December of that year, with over 100 angry parents and former students of Merkel's demanding that the board drop the case against her. It did not, but a county judge had the good sense to do exactly that, ruling that, quote, no crime occurred here. This is one small example of government tyranny run amok, but since then I've seen it become the norm in the United States, where people are now being arrested for almost everything. Kids jailed without trial for shoplifting, hijackers jailed for arguing correctly with cops that it's not illegal for them to thumb for a ride. Non-white youths in many cities stopped and frisked for walking while black or Hispanic, and then getting busted on trumped-up charges, like resisting arrest. And when the cops find no guns or drugs on them, protesters beaten and gassed and jailed for simply trying to exercise their First Amendment rights. But that's just the surface. As a journalist in China, I had to watch my back at all times. Spies from the Ministry of State Security, China's KGB, or one of the local public security bureaus that operate under its jurisdiction would secretly follow my movements and keep track of whoever I interviewed. In one case, after my departure, they badly beat a source to the point he had to be hospitalized for reconstructive surgery to his crushed cheekbones, and his groin region was also left black and blue after a beating. The man's offense, he had shown me around a rural region where peasants were improving their lives by sending some of their children off to city to do construction jobs. I thought this kind of monitoring and intimidation of sources was a nightmare back in China. Now it's happening here in the United States, only worse. Take it from there, Gerald.
Well, I'd like to read you a quote. Quote, driven by martial rhetoric and the availability of military-style equipment, from bayonets and M16 rifles to armored personnel carriers, American police forces have often adopted a mindset previously reserved for the battlefield. The war on drugs and more recently post-9/11 anti-terrorism efforts have created a new figure on the U.S. scene. The warrior cop, armed to the teeth, ready to deal harshly with targeted wrongdoers, and a growing threat to familiar American liberties. You know what left-wing publication that came from? The Wall Street Journal. That's how prevalent it is. That's how pervasive it is that everybody sees it. This isn't a left or right-wing issue. This isn't a conservative or Republican issue. It's a real issue. Who made this stuff up that National Security Agency has to watch us, every move that we make? And one lie told after another in defense of their looking at us. And who are the people that are watching us? Well, people like the head of the National Intelligence Agency, James Clapper. So at the Senate hearing just 2 days ago, he was asked the NSA Chief General Keith Alexander, how many disrupted terrorist plots did they learn from spending? By the way, the number that I read in the Financial Times, Gary, is $80 billion a year that we the people are spending on them watching us. And most of the money, of course, is going to the military or cyber-industrial complex, as this is the case, is such companies as Booz Allen Hamilton. Anyway, they said initially 54 terrorist plots, thanks to the constant spying and the telephone watches that they've been doing. So now it came down to, he said at that hearing that he admitted that of the 54 plots, only 13 had anything to do with the United States. And as Leahy kept questioning him, he conceded that the program only actually foiled one, or perhaps two plots from the surveillance. So when Clapper was questioned about this, he said that what it really does, and this will make everybody feel great, all of this surveillance, it provides, quote, peace of mind. So that's what it is. And why is it happening? Well, with the wars that the United States has been fighting, all of this immorality, the fish rots at the head down. And they've militarized the people that have they put in their heads, and these are the people that come back from doing tours of duty in Afghanistan and Iraq, seeing slaughter and slaughtering. You know, they come back with this kind of mentality. And this is what's happened to the police forces. So when you have a publication like the Wall Street Journal pointing it out, and then it's also what happens when society breaks down. I want to make two things very clear, and I hear this all the time. They accuse Obama of being, socialist or Marxist or communist. Obamacare is forcing us to buy insurance from insurance giants, private companies, and you saw their stocks. They've all gone up smartly since Obamacare has been talked about, and actually when it was passed, it's been on a straight trajectory up on stocks. We're being forced to buy from private corporations. And then we had too big to fails that began under George Bush and accelerated and continued under Barack Obama. Bailing out too big to fails. In capitalism, there is no such thing as too big to fails. I'm mentioning this because it goes back to the police state. It's called fascism. It's the merger of state and corporate powers. And that's not my definition. That's the definition of someone who knew a thing or two about it, Mussolini.
Go through Obamacare. That was one of my questions for you. And show us what you're concerned about. I'm concerned that the Republicans want to defeat it for the wrong reasons, and the Democrats wanted to defend it for the wrong reasons. And I'll give you my point on it, but I want to hear yours.
Well, I agree with you. They're using, as I see it, Obamacare as a red herring, and that's to make other drastic cuts. And the cuts that they're going to make, and you even heard Obama say it this past week on CNBC. I mean, you can't get more of a corporate station than that. And he was saying that they would address entitlements. Address entitlements? I hate that word. What do you mean entitlements? This is our money that we put into these programs. Oh, and now they're entitlements? But Obama said he would address those. So when I look at Obamacare, or like they like to call it, affordable care. These are cut-rate plans, and they're making people responsible for a lot of money to cover costs that aren't being covered by these. And as you know, the premiums, they vary from state to state. And when I talk about the merger of state and corporate powers, as we know, people that opt out, that don't get insurance, they're going to be forced to pay a fine. I mean, you can't make this up. And what they're doing, of course, is they're forcing people to sign up, particularly young people who are relatively, they're in better health. And that, of course, is to offset the cost from the elderly, who, as you well know, after, I think, the age of 55 or something, the statistics really, go way up in terms of what kind of health care is needed. And I just want to divert for 1 second on health care. And of all the people and all the things that you've been teaching over the years, and you were one of the first people when I started looking into alternative and complementary medicine, you were one of the first people out there of anybody talking about this. We could have the best health program in the world, the most affordable and the best treatment. It's not going to do one thing to help the people of this country, not until the health of the individuals are improved. Obama and the rest, they keep calling us exceptional. Americans' exceptionalism. We're exceptionally the most obese people on the planet. We exceptionally eat the most garbage food of anybody out there that could afford the best, and we buy the worst. We drink all of this junk. You were talking about exercise and health. And you and I are around the same age, and you know that most people our age aren't like us. And because we work at what's trying to stay in shape and live healthy and eat healthy. So we can have the best health care in the world. It's not going to make one bit of difference considering the health of the people. So moving on to the program. Let's say you are a young person and you're making what people make these days, because 95% of the jobs that have been created over the last year are part-time jobs. That's a fact. So, yeah, you're making $25,000 a year. Well, if you get sick and your cost, you may end up paying as much as $6,350. That's the cap that's going to come out of your pocket. Hey, that's a lot of money if you're only making $25,000 a year, and it's $12,500 for a family of four that's earning $50,000, and that median income is only about $54,000. So that's a big chunk. And then they're limiting the choice of doctors and the insurers. So they're limiting what this is doing. Again, it goes back to what I was saying. It's called fascism, because now there's a consolidation going on. You're only going to have a few people to go to. You'll have Walmart's RX. You're going to have the cheapest healthcare systems, the bottom line garbage that they're going to pass off as health under Obamacare as it all becomes concentrated in the hands of the few. So that's how I see what the program is.
That's very insightful. Thank you, Gerald. I'm going to come back to Obamacare in a moment for my own thoughts, but I also want to share some of the latest statistics on what it means to be a person under 30, and then I would like for you to address them, please. These are the latest statistics. These are all official statistics. The labor force participation rate for men 18 to 24 is the lowest in our recorded history, including during the Great Depression. The ratio of what men in 18 to 30 are earning compared to the rest of the population is the lowest point of all time. About 1/3 of all adults in their early 20s are working a full-time job, which means 2/3 are part-time, as you mentioned. And for 18 to 30-year-old age bracket, the full-time employment rate is falling, and it's only 43% of the entire age group that had a full-time job. Also, 53% of all Americans with a BA degree under the age of 25 are unemployed or underemployed, over half. And at this point, half of all recent college graduates are working at jobs that don't require a college degree. The number of Americans up to 30 years of age with a job declined by 18%, And according to one survey, 82% of all Americans believe that it is harder for young adults to find jobs today than it was when our generation, as you mentioned, were trying to find jobs. We had no problem. It is also 47 times larger than the median net worth of households, and that is that people who are 65 or older are much wealthier than people who are 30 or under. So when people are young, looking at what it means to get older and realizing they're not going to have 30, 40, 50 years to accumulate wealth or anything, they're very depressed about that. Also, the SAT scores for young men were the worst they've been since records were kept. And approximately two-thirds of all college students graduated with enormous student loan debt, and the student loan debt has risen 275% in the last 10 years. And finally, the student loan default rate, which you can't pay the bill, but you don't get out of the debt. It just keeps compounding. If you say, I can't pay anything, A, they can have a SWAT team arrest you. B, in 27 states, there's debtor's prison. So could you imagine for the first time that a student couldn't pay a debt, a loan, couldn't pay the compounding interest on it, and then was arrested by a for-profit private security company, put into a for-profit private prison, and charged $130 to $150 a day when you didn't have that to begin with. You might be living at your parents' with no money, and now you're in prison, and that will be a part of your record. And in fact, there are more than 100,000 janitors today with college degrees, and there are 317,000 waiters and waitresses with advanced college degrees. And so you look at what it means to be a young, educated person today in the United States, I don't see where they're given any advantage, and I see nothing in Congress, the executive branch, or the mainstream that are trying to help these people. Your thoughts, please.
This is a trend that was long in the making. You know, I wrote the book Trends 2000 back in 1996, and I had it called The Re-Extended Family, and how people were going to be moving, you know, back at home. So now we have a record high, 22 million millennials, as they call them. And those are people between the ages of 18 and 31 that live with their parents. Gary, that's up almost 20% since the Great Recession hit. So what we have is the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few. I came up with it. It's going to be in the next TrendsJournal, actually. I had an epiphany. This isn't globalization. It's multinationalization. I talked about the merger of state and corporate powers. You have a few running everything. The college scam is just that. It's a joke. I mean, unless you're going for something that you're really going to be able to turn into a return on investment, so to speak, you're just wasting your money. Yes, it's nice to get a degree in art history or sociology or psych major, but, you know, if you can afford to do that and advance your education, that's wonderful. But if you're among not the 99%, then you better think twice. And as you well know, we now see college debt surpassing $1 trillion, bigger than credit card debt. And you mentioned about how you become an indentured servant. You never get out of this debt virtually. It's very important that people know the drivers behind making those laws as draconian as they are. It began at the end of the Clinton administration. And when Joe Biden was senator, was at that loophole state over there, he was from Delaware, he was one of the prime pushers behind it. So those are the people that put it into place. But it's important also to look beyond the United States. We're looking at a quarter of the world's youth without jobs or education. So now you start putting all the pieces together. You're a young person now. Let's say you're 18, 19 years old. You want to go to college. You say, what am I going to go to college for? I got so many of my friends, they're in debt. You know, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 in debt. They can't find jobs. As you mentioned, they're waiters, they're waitresses, barristers. Isn't that a nice word? A barrister. When I was a young kid working at York's at the North End in Yonkers, I was a soda jerk. We didn't even call it, I should have been called a barrister, you know. But anyway, those are the kind of jobs. So you say to yourself, why am I going to go to college? So now what this is also going to breed is a continuing growth of a more uneducated population. And I was thinking of the kind of jobs that if they should train people in college for, there was just a new release that came out yesterday. Amazon's going to hire 70,000 workers. Oh, wonderful. Maybe they should have given a course in college on how to stock shelves, or how about shipping and delivery, wrapping products, because that's what the jobs that are being created. Again, you know, people ask me, you know, you're giving the problems, what are some of the solutions? And I simply ask, when was it better? I could tell you when it was better. It was better when there were laws in place that made this kind of behavior impossible. It was called the Clayton Antitrust Act, the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Robertson-Patman Act. If you wanted to go in business, everybody gets the same price on everything. You don't get a better deal because you're buying more than me. That's what allowed the competition. This was America. It was a level playing field. Just because you had more money, that didn't mean you got all the breaks. And again, when you look at the facts, well, you well know them, and I'm sure your audience does. And we're seeing the numbers coming out where that 10% of the population owns 50% of the nation's assets. 400 people are in possession of $2 trillion worth of wealth. That's greater than the gross national product of countries like Italy or Canada or Mexico. You know the numbers. 1% own 20%. So now we have the gap between the rich and the poor, and the wealth in the hands of so few. We haven't seen these numbers since 100 years ago. So when we're looking at the world's youth, there's another element to this, Gary, and that's where you're going to start seeing revolutions.
Okay, that brings me to the next issue. This is from Max Kaiser from Global Research. You know Max.
Oh, I know Max.
Max has a lot of respect for you. Max says, U.S. economy is just one giant hedge fund. Here's what he says, quote, American lawmakers have colluded with Wall Street executives to build an economy that no longer works in the best interest of or even needs the majority of the American public. There's a lot of hype, and some would say overreaction around all of this, but the telltale sign is the markets. They haven't reacted negatively. Is there any crisis here? They're asking. Well, as an aside, I studied what all the people, the talking heads on Wall Street and all the financial so-called experts, none of them saw a problem. Here's what Max Kaiser said, quote, I think we should take the words of Warren Buffett to heart. He basically described the Federal Reserve Bank and the American economy as one giant hedge fund, and he's absolutely correct. The way that Wall Street, Washington, these large funds approach America is as a trade that is backed by $120,000 or $130,000 of debt, and that debt gets traded around every day. And the whole initiative here is to buy hedge funds and try to squeak out profits, and they don't really care who they hurt in the process. Remember, America is run by what I call financial jihadists, who are basically suicide bankers. Warren Buffett, of course, is one of these suicide bankers, and America, from the outside, of course, looks like they're trying to commit financial suicide. But that's what a financial jihadist does, or a suicide banker. They blow themselves up for their cause, and in this case, it's market fundamentalism, a belief in the profit, not the profit. And then he also says that when you're able to print $130 billion a month in a new quantitative easing, there'll be another huge rally. Well, the smart money would say short stock markets right now, and then when they raise the debt ceiling and print all this hundreds of billions per month, you'll be able to come in with an insider and scoop the profit. You know, he's saying we've got nothing but a rigged system. And I add one more thing on to that. This is a short piece, but important, that is never discussed. And this is called The Big Banks Manipulated Gold and Silver Markets from Washington Blog. Quote, The Guardian reported that gold and silver prices are, quote, fixed in the same way as interest rates and derivatives. In daily conference calls by the powers that be, longtime trader Andrew Maguire told King World News this week that J.P. Morgan whistleblowers had handed over evidence of gold and silver manipulation by their bank. Quote, very recently, Commodities Future Trading Commissioner Chilton assured me, and I'm going to quote him exactly, quote, I can't appropriately express my frustration and disappointment with how we've handled the silver investigation. And as you know, I'm prohibited from actually saying much. That said, I will not let September go by without speaking out if the agency doesn't do so, end quote. I was also contacted by 2 J.P. Morgan employees who told me they had a large amount of documented evidence of market trading, abuses in gold and silver by their bank, J.P. Morgan, and they handed over to the CFTC. And, well, we'll have to wait and see what they actually do with it. Now, big banks have manipulated virtually every market, both in the financial sector and the real economy, and broken virtually every law on the books. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission says that J.P. Morgan has massively manipulated energy markets in California and the Midwest, obtaining tens of millions of dollars in overpayments from grid operators just in one year alone. They manipulated commodities. They manipulated interest rates. They completely manipulated the $800 trillion in assets pegged to the LIBOR, and LIBOR is still being manipulated. They manipulated derivatives. They manipulated oil prices. In fact, anything that we trade in, they manipulate, and they do it in, quote, a mafia-style big rigging fraud against local governments, big governments, and they also manipulated the price of gold and silver. Your thoughts, please.
Again, you mentioned LIBOR. I mean, here they're rigging the interest rates. And this isn't, a conspiracy theory. It's a fact. What happens? Well, you pick up the Financial Times last week, a big front page story. Wire fraud and conspiracy charges. Interdealer pays $55 million in probes. The people that rigged the LIBOR market. That's what they get, a slap on the wrist. Pick up today's paper. Citigroup fined $30 million for analysts' Apple leak. And I love this language. Citigroup Inc. agreed to pay one of the biggest fines for improper research practices in a decade after investigators said an analyst leaked negative information, blah, 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 blah. But listen to the language. Fine for improper research practices? How about dirty dealing? Could anybody say that? And you mentioned this fellow Chilton. And with that fine, for example, with the LIBOR. Last week, this is his language. He said regarding the lousy, it was $55 million fine, quote, this was insolent conduct impacting a benchmark rate that influences almost everything consumers buy on credit. These benchmarks are just too important to become a playground for some big talking bad guys. Oh, yeah, he's a real tough one, isn't he? A playground for some big talking bad guys. Nobody can get away with this stuff. A playground? Big talk? What are you talking about? How about the criminals? How about they're destroying the lives of hundreds of millions of people for their own benefit? So this goes back to the beginning of your show when you were talking about how they arrested that teacher for doing nothing and accusing her of stealing $400 worth of art supplies. The bad guys, they get a slap on the wrist. So the whole game is rigged. And the CFTC stopped the investigation against J.P. Morgan on the silver issue. And again, another softball statement thrown out by Chilton.
Well, we know for a fact that the Federal Reserve is behind this because they're the ones who are the largest purchasers of gold. And at this past year, which caused the price of gold to dip by hundreds of dollars per ounce, bringing it down to almost $1,200 at one point. If the free market existed, if people knew the truth about the value of the dollar and the printing of $21 trillion in fiat currency with nothing to back it up, just so that they could keep buying up these bonds and concreting the debt and payments on the debt and their wars and everything else, what do you believe that gold and silver would rise to?
If gold even rose to its level when it hit the high in 1980 at $850, just accounting for inflation, it should be over $2,000. Gold could go to $5,000. There's going to be a point when they have to stop the tapering. You mentioned it, $21 trillion dumped into the system. Oh, and I just want to go back I forgot one little point about the Commodities Future Trading Commission. You know who the commissioner is. He's stepping down soon. Gary Gensler. Who's Gary Gensler? Well, he worked for the Goldman Sachs gang, as did, of course, the guy under Bush that brought us too big to fail, Henry Paulson. Oh, and who did Gary Gensler work for? Well, he worked for, didn't he work for John Corzine when John Corzine was the head of Goldman Sachs? Oh, you remember John Corzine, the guy that was governor and senator of New Jersey, and also the head of MF Global? Yeah, the one that robbed segregated accounts of people's money, like my own. Oh, you saw what they did to John Corzine, didn't you? You saw the rough treatment he got. Oh, that's right. I think he's still raising money for Obama in the Democratic Party. Nothing. So, moving forward on gold, you're looking at demand going around the world that continues to skyrocket, and they're doing everything they can to stop people from buying it. India, as everybody knows, they love gold as much as curry. And now it's becoming very difficult for the Indians to buy gold. It's becoming prohibitive to buy gold coins and medallions in India. They're putting a tax on it because the rupee is going way down, because the economy is crashing, and because of the tapering, the hot money's leaving these emerging markets. But they're stopping the people from buying gold. Despite that, in the last quarter, possession of gold for delivery, for hard possession, increased 53%. In Thailand, it's run away right now. People are trying to buy all they can. The older nations, the people who have been around a longer time, they've seen this many times before. So they're bailing out of their paper currencies.